everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Have you ever been put on the spot? Maybe someone's asked you a question after you've presented, or someone's beckoned to you into the room and said, hey, can you quickly give us an update on your project? How's things going? Or you put on the spot at a meeting. Oh, Peter, you work in that area. Have you got any comments, any recommendations? And of course, we call this thing thinking and speaking off the cuff. It's also called impromptu speaking. It's also called speaking without notice. And some people call it being thrown in the deep end. So good morning. My aim is to give you just a few tips so the next time you are thrown in the deep end, get that unexpected question, put on the spot, everyone's looking at you and you're sort of starting to tread water as your mind turns to come up with an answer. I'm hoping you'll be more effective and more confident. I run this as a one-day workshop, by the way, and did this yesterday in Perth, have got another one coming up in Perth later on in the month. So I've just taken a few little tips to put in this webinar because this is my most popular workshop. Let's get started. So how do you master the art of off-the-cuff, impromptu speaking, thinking on your feet, speaking without notice, whatever you want to call it? And my own story is that of having to overcome fear, having to overcome my stutter. So many times I was in that same scenario, and job interview for me was diabolical. Not only did I have to think and be agile with my answer, but my fear and my nerves would kick up. So I had that double-edged sword of thinking on the feet, trying to control nerves, and also trying to deal with my stutter. Today, ask questions as we go. I will keep an eye on the chat box and the comments or questions. You can raise your hand. That lets me know that you've got something to say in the chat box. Participate by writing in your own comments. Maybe you've got some examples or scenarios where you've been thrown in the deep end. One scenario I had as well, I was a witness in a court of law. I saw a motor vehicle accident and I know what happened. However, the defense lawyer, their role is to make me look silly. So the level of questioning and the detail that went into my witness statement made me look less than sure on what I was saying. So that was something I just didn't expect. Please take notes and think, how might you respond the next time you're in the spotlight, in the deep end? And as I mentioned, this webinar is recorded should you wish to review anything. So here's some tips for you for thinking and speaking off the cuff. These are common mistakes to avoid. So the first common mistake to avoid is having no structure in your presentation. This is when people do the verbal diarrhea. They just say stuff. So one of the things I'm going to share with you is off-the-cuff speaking requires structure. Introducing new material, a new idea into your concluding remarks. And what happens is you say stuff, you're answering, you're giving people your point of view, and then you remember one thing and you throw it in at the end. And that can be confusing and distract from what your core message. So if you remember something at the end that you need to throw in and include, oh, by the way, one more thing, put it in, but I now want you to come back and once again nail your ending. Failing to conclude, this is just leaving the balls in the air, leaving the audience hanging in terms of what your answer is. Foot in mouth, rushing in to answer the question. This is saying first thing that comes to mind and then later realizing you should have toned it down, or maybe it was a little bit politically incorrect. There's some people in the room that may be offended by what you've said, so I should have taken a little bit more time before I spoke that answer. Not answering the question. Generally, you're not a politician, so that avoidance of the question won't get you the job interview. It won't put you in the good eyes of the boss if you keep avoiding the questions and the problem he has and he's asking for your advice and you keep avoiding the question, that won't serve you well. Just saying stuff, a little bit of verbal diarrhea once again. Trying to answer the question when you have no knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the data, don't try to answer it. I think one of the keys for me is not knowing everything, but knowing where to get the answer. Really good question. I don't have the answer. I've got a colleague who specializes in that area. Let me get back to you by the end of the meeting. And finally, answering the question beautifully and then continuing to speak. This is becoming verbose. I see this in job interview a lot, and I've also seen this in conference presentations where the speaker does a beautiful job and the MC comes on stage and says, oh, we've got 6 minutes for 2 or 3 questions. Are there any questions? And one question comes up and then the speaker spends 6 minutes on the one question. And that is the end of the Q&A session. So be brief with your off-the-cuff responses. Get to the point as quick as you can. If you avoid those common mistakes, in my view, straight away, you will be more effective, more confident the next time you are put into the deep end. And welcome, Patrick, and a few others. So, mistakes to avoid. People think that off-the-cuff speaking gives you a license to just do a verbal diarrhea, go wherever you want to without putting a little bit of structure in it. So here's some tips to help you. Stay calm and composed. The terminology I use for this is remain calm while under fire. And that can include your non-verbal communication. If you get caught out or if there's a job interview question or an audience member asks you a question that's really quite tough and you let your body language collapse and your eye contact goes away and the and oh, gee whiz, goes away, comes forward, they're going to know that you really don't know what you're talking about. So stay calm and composed. And one of the things that I encourage you to do, just a quick show of hands, put your hand up if you know 100% of everything there is to know in your area of expertise. There's nothing you don't know. Put your hand up. One would hope no hands go up. So here's the thing. When you get a question that you need to do a little bit more research or consider, please take that on notice. It goes something like this. So thank you for that question. That's a really good question. And look, I don't want to mislead anyone. Let me get back to you by the end of close of business today. It's called taking the question on notice. You can't use it for every question, but if you do get a really good question that you think, I need a little bit more time to answer this properly, take it on notice. Take the question on notice. Our politicians in Parliament take questions on notice and they say, I'll take that on notice. And they're given 72 hours, 3 days to find out the answer and get back to Parliament. I wouldn't recommend that you take 3 days to get back to your boss. Job interview, you can't take it on notice. You need to come up with a response or you're not going to get the job, be considered for the job. So stay calm. When faced with an impromptu speaking situation, calm, composed, keep that breathing going. The eye contact remains, conversational language, nice presence, keep the breathing going. And the thing with staying calm is your mind, your cognition is now free to do a little bit more thinking. Whereas if you let the nervousness kick in, then your mind scrambles and the chance of coming up with a good answer are lessened. Listen actively, pay close attention to the question. And one of the things I do is I'll often paraphrase the question. At job interview, perfectly okay to paraphrase the question. So if I've heard you correctly, you want me to give an example of when I've used my project management skills to bring a project back on track that was going a little bit off track. And what will happen? Two things. Number one, the interview panel will nod. Brilliant, you've heard it correctly. Number two, if I use slightly different words, I've got greater clarity on what the question was. And number three, I've also brought myself a little bit of time to think about how am I going to answer that. So the active listening and just checking in helps you to formulate that response. The reflecting back also enables you to buy that little bit of time to gather your thoughts. Structure your response. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on. My main comment from this day forth, every time you get asked a question, every time you get asked to comment, every time you get asked for your opinion at a meeting, think of this as a speech topic to do a mini structured speech. I'll say that again. Every time you get a question, asked to comment off the cuff, think of it as now doing a mini speech. If you knew you were doing a speech in a week's time, you would prepare and you'd have a beginning and you'd have a middle and you'd have an end. Do the same thing for off-the-cuff speaking. So structure your response. Start strong if you can. Follow up with a few examples. And one of the best ways to respond to a question is, in my experience, or the last time I tried to do that, or the last time we as an organization, this is just calling on previous experience. There's lots of different models to help you think and formulate your response. Another one would be the advantages and the disadvantages, also known as pros and cons. So someone asks you a question, you might just repeat it back. So that's really an interesting question. So you want to know if I think doing this will solve that problem. I guess the advantages of that solution are we'll get this, we'll get this, we'll get that. The disadvantages of that are this risk might occur, we're at risk of this happening. And as you're saying that, your own mind will tip the scales one way or the other, and you'll be able to then say, so therefore, I think it's too risky. In my advice, I would not recommend we do that. So that's just another model to help you think and structure your response. Pros and cons. Use filler phrases strategically. One of those filler phrases is repeating the question. Or that's a really interesting question. There's a few politicians who say, thanks for that really great question, really great question. What is this doing? It's starting strong and it's giving you a little bit of time to gather your thoughts. Help you maintain control of the conversation, maintain control of your own confidence, and work out how you might be going to respond to it. And my final tip around thinking and speaking off the cuff is it's not just a random skill. It's not like you go to the gym once every 6 months and stay fit. It is a skill you need to keep practicing. So the more you engage in impromptu speaking, the better. If you were doing a job interview, you would probably practice. You'd do some mock interviews with a colleague. There's a club called Toastmasters where impromptu or table topics, off-the-cuff speaking, occurs on a regular basis. There are online Toastmasters meetings, so you can join a club and be in a remote and rural community and still participate in a regular once a fortnight Toastmasters meeting where every now and then you'll get asked, so what do you think about, or what's the worst holiday you've ever had? And then you're standing up and you've got 90 seconds to speak off the cuff with no time to prepare. So this is a muscle that you need to keep practicing. There is a little tool called Yoodli, Yoodli. YOODLI.ai. It's in the suite of hundreds of thousands of artificial intelligence tools, and Udly can ask you questions. You invite it to a Zoom meeting like today, and you say to Udly, ask me questions in the area of solar energy and solar batteries. Are they worthwhile? Have they come down in price? Is the break-even time worthwhile? What is their life expectancy? And Udly goes away and finds out questions and then asks them to you. And it also gives you feedback on how well you went. So it'll count your ums and ahs. It'll tell you whether you spoke too fast or had lots of filler words that actually don't mean much. And actually, when you think about some of the words people actually say, actually, if they didn't use the word actually, they make more sense, actually. Udly does all this for you. This is your speaking coach you can invite to a meeting and practice that off the cuff. So you can do a presentation, a prepared presentation, and then you can go to Udly and say, so Udly, based on this presentation, what questions is the audience likely to ask me? And then Udly becomes your audience and says, well, what do you think about this, Peter? And you get a question you weren't expecting, created by artificial intelligence, and you now have to respond. And then Udly will give you feedback on your response. So practice, practice, practice. Here's my model for thinking and speaking off the cuff. This is what I taught in my one-day workshop. It's called the RISE model. It's an acronym, and I use it. It helps me to remember, and it gives me the idea of rise with confidence. Rise with the knowledge that you have got this Q&A session under control. And it's a fairly simple acronym, but this is the model that helps you put structure and everything we've just spoken about in all into one simple model. Resist time pressure. So this is so you don't put foot in mouth. So thanks for that question. That's a really interesting question. That reminds me of, if I hear you correctly, you want to know when I've used my project management skills to bring a project back on track that was going a little bit over budget over time. All of that is buying a little bit of time. Could you please repeat the question for me? Buying time. So what can you do so that you don't speak that first thought? Now, here's my belief. Probably 90% of the time we will go with first thought. But I'm asking you not to announce it, because when you say no, that won't work. You cannot then say, well, hang on, maybe, oh yeah, pros and cons. Oh, there is, okay, it might be a worthwhile idea. That doesn't look very good. So rather than say, no, that won't work, I would rather say, well, okay, that's interesting. My mind's no, that won't work. Let me think about it. What are the advantages? Yep, really good. This. What are the risks? Da-da-da. Yeah, look, I think the risks are quite significant. So no, I don't think that'll work. I've still gone with my first response with front of mind, but I've given myself some time to think about it before announcing it. So the R in the RISE model means resist time pressure. What can you do to buy yourself that 5, 6, 7 seconds, 10 seconds before you answer the question immediately? Repeat it, a few filler phrases, strategic filler phrases that you can use. This is what our politicians are taught to do. Use that time to identify your point of view. What do I know about this question? Which model's going to help me? I'm going to use my personal experience. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. I'm going to talk about in the past, at the moment, and what it's going to look like in the future. That's called past, present, future. This allows me to sort of rack and stack my information. It enables me to filter, to look through the filter of what I know and how am I going to answer. Is it a hot topic, so I need to tone down my response? Is it a emotion-laden question? And maybe I might be better to take that one on notice and get back to you. The S in the RISE model is use a structure in your presentation. If you are preparing a presentation for next week, you know that you would create an opening, a body, and then you'd have a conclusion. You would do that. Why don't we do that off the cuff? And the model I use, the structure, is simply the 3 T's. The 3 T's. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. So thanks for that question. If I hear you correctly, you'd like to know when I've used my project management skills to bring a project that was going over time, over budget, back on track. Yep, I get the nod. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So here's an example of my project management skills. It was back when I was working for the Health Department of Western Australia, and we had a huge issue of trying to create a skin bank for burns victims. Then I'm going to go through it. And then, so therefore, an example of me using my project management skills to bring a project that was off track, off budget, back on track, was when I intervened and was able to bring that skin bank project back on track. It's a simple model, 3 T's. So you've asked me, what do I think about the future of nuclear energy in Australia? And that's a really interesting question. It's in the media at the moment. And in much of Australia, we can't guarantee the continuity of electricity moving forward. People may have to turn off their lights. Businesses may not be able to continue operating because of the uncertainty of our electricity generation in the future. So it's a good time to have a discussion about nuclear energy. And so far, I have said nothing. Then I might go to pros and cons, advantages of nuclear energy. We've got lots of uranium in Australia. It's in our backyard. It's also greenhouse gas friendly, so we can significantly lower our carbon footprint if we choose to generate electricity using nuclear energy. The risks are it's very expensive, and we've had a few disasters around the world, Fukushima and Chernobyl. And what do you do with the waste product? You just bury it in our backyard. So there's a few risks involved, and I think it's a little bit risky. And I think many Australians are still apprehensive about nuclear energy. So therefore, my opinion of nuclear energy is I don't really support it. There we have it. And the most important thing of the RISE model is nail your ending. So this is the 3rd T. Tell them what you've told them. And please use strong language. Don't end like this. So that's what I think about nuclear energy, because you're relying on me to remember what that is. And so that's an example of when I brought a project back on track. What is that? So in conclusion, my opinion is I do not support nuclear energy. That is the nailing of the ending. So when everyone walks out of the room, out of the meeting, they have no doubt what your position is. So that is the RISE model. Resist time pressure. Use that time that you've got. You've brought a bit of time to identify your point of view. This is the rack stacking filtering. Structure. If you were preparing a speech, beginning, middle, and end, I'm saying, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then nail your ending and tell them what you just told them. And the E is, of course, indeed, end strong or nail your ending. That is my simple model that will help you with your off-the-cuff speaking. In summary, stay calm, remain calm while under fire. Job interviews are stressful. Q&A sessions when you're delivering bad news are heated and difficult. Listen carefully. Don't be afraid to paraphrase. Structure your response. We've got the RISE model we can put in there now. Use those filler phrases. That reminds me of, that's an interesting question. Great time to have that discussion, because at the moment, and off-the-cuff speaking, to become proficient at it is not an occasional skill. So you need to go to the gym and exercise your off-the-cuff speaking muscle. Practice, practice, practice. And of course, the RISE model is my model that I weave all the way through those points. Helps me stay calm. The repeating of the question is resisting time pressure. Questions, comments? keep an eye out for the chat box. Hands up if you have any questions. Upcoming workshops. I'm off to Melbourne on Friday. I've got a regional trip in Bendigo, Swan Hill, Mildura, and then back to Melbourne on the 14th, where I'm running a presentation skills workshop. I mentioned thinking and speaking off the cuff. This is the one-day workshop of this short webinar. Perth, 7th of October. Then I'm up north, Karratha, 4th of November and 5th of November. If you know of anyone that might benefit from these workshops, or if you indeed would like to attend, feel free to contact me. Upcoming webinars, for those of you who are webinar junkies and find this worthwhile. October, the art of persuasion, the art of influence. The reverse is your hot air, beautiful speaker, speaking lovely, great voice, Peter. Love your beard, you're on time, but you've had no impact. No one wants to do that. And a few techniques to help you become more relaxed, overcome a bit of anxiety, a little bit of nerves around, I've been invited to speak at a conference. There's going to be 200 people. I've said yes, and now I've realized that this is going to be nerve-wracking. Some tips to help you become more relaxed. These are my free webinars. They're around 30 minutes. I'm going to probably end a little bit early today. And this is how I like to serve my community. You know how to reach me, email, phone number there. I like to support people beyond webinars, beyond workshops. Send me an email if you've got any difficulties, any problems. So thanks for your participation. I'm just looking down. Email me a question if anything comes up. I've got no chats. I cannot see any questions. No hands up. All right. And remember, thinking and speaking off the cuff, really important. It's an everyday skill. It's when you respond to questions. It's when you get put on the spot. Stay calm. Listen carefully. Use a structure in your response. Don't be afraid to use filler phrases. Our politicians that say that's an interesting question, that's a really good question, they don't say it just for fun. They say it because they're trained to use that. Those few seconds it gives you to gather your thoughts. And politicians, they practice and they practice. When they agree to do a media interview, they have one of their communication staff throw questions at them, and then they practice responding with no time, and the media experts will coach them and say, no, you're a little bit loose on that one. And of course, my model, use the RISE model. Thank you very much for your participation. And so go out there and embrace this beast that we call thinking and speaking off the cuff. And I've just got a Q&A that I'm coming up. And thank you for that. Very short, very brief, a lot more to it. But please, never let fear be the reason you don't stand up, you don't put your hand up, that you don't share what you've got to say. Bye for now. Thanks, everyone.